The village of Ikena lay cracked and bare under the unforgiving sun. The soil was parched, and the river that once flowed through the heart of the village had long since dried up. The trees wilted, their branches reaching to the sky as if begging for the clouds to open up. But the sky was a relentless stretch of blue, with not a cloud in sight. The people of Ikena were desperate. They had endured 3 years of drought, 3 years of misery. Children cried from thirst, mothers sat with empty calabashes, and the men were too weak to hunt. Finally, the elders gathered, their faces somber and worn. "Something must be done," said Ikena, the village head, his voice cracking with the weight of his words. "Our people cannot last another dry season." "But who can help us now?" a villager asked, his voice filled with despair. "We have tried everything." It was then that Amaka, a woman with hair as white as the drought-dried sands, spoke up. "There is one man who can bring us rain," she said, her eyes narrowed with both fear and hope. Ikena sighed heavily. "You speak of Okafor, the last rainmaker. But there is a reason we have not called upon him. His powers, they come at a price. Would you rather we die here, slowly withering like the plants around us?" Amaka countered. "We must ask him. If he can bring rain, we must be willing to pay whatever price he asks." The elders looked at each other, fear in their eyes. Okafor was a mystery, a recluse who lived on the edge of the village, far from the others. No one knew the source of his powers, but it was said he communed with spirits, that he had paid dearly for his abilities. After a long silence, Ikena nodded. "We will go to Okafor. Let the young ones prepare to fetch him." That night, under the silver light of the moon, Chimeka and his sister, Amora, made their way to the edge of the village. The air was still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. They reached Okafor's hut, a small structure hidden behind a tangle of trees and vines. "Do you think he will help us?" Amora whispered, her voice trembling. "He must," Chimeka replied, though he himself was unsure. He knocked on the door. The door creaked open, and there stood Okafor, tall and thin, his eyes dark and piercing. He looked at the 2 young villagers with a gaze that seemed to look straight into their souls. "You seek rain," he said simply, his voice as deep as a distant thunderstorm. Chimeka nodded. "Our village is dying. We have come to ask for your help." Okafor stared at them for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The inside of his hut was dimly lit, filled with the scent of herbs and strange objects hanging from the ceiling. "I can bring the rain," Okafor said, his voice low and serious. "But there is a price." "What price?" Amora asked, her voice barely a whisper. Okafor's eyes seemed to darken. "For the rain to come, a sacrifice must be made. Someone from the village must be given to the spirits." Chimeka and Amora exchanged a look of horror. "A sacrifice?" Chimeka stammered. "What kind of sacrifice?" Okafor's gaze was steady. "A life. The spirits demand a life in exchange for the rain." The siblings were silent, the weight of Okafor's words settling over them like a shroud. After a long moment, Chimeka spoke. We must discuss this with the elders." Okafor nodded. "But know this, once the decision is made, there is no turning back." The next day, the village gathered under the ancient Iroko tree, the sun blazing down on them. Chimeka and Amora relayed Okafor's words, and a murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. "A sacrifice," one woman cried, clutching her child to her chest. "How can we ask someone to give their life?" "But if we do nothing, we will all perish," Amaka said firmly. "The Rainmaker has spoken. This is our only chance." The villagers argued, fear and desperation clouding their minds. Finally, Ikena raised his hand, silencing them. "We must think carefully," he said. The spirits demand a life, but we cannot force someone to make this sacrifice. It must be voluntary. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Who among them would willingly give their life? Then, to everyone's surprise, Chiemeka stepped forward. "I will go," he said, his voice strong and steady. "If my life can save our village, I am willing." Amora gasped, grabbing her brother's arm. "No, Chiemeka. You can't." He looked at her, his face filled with determination. "Amora, if I don't do this, we may all die. I want to save you, to save everyone." The villagers watched, their faces etched with sorrow and admiration. They knew the sacrifice Chiemeka was making, and they were grateful, yet terrified of what was to come. That night, under the light of the full moon, the village gathered around Okafor's hut. Chiemeka stood at the center, his head held high, his eyes filled with both fear and resolve. Okafor began the ritual, chanting in a language older than time. He sprinkled herbs and powders into the fire, causing it to flare up, casting eerie shadows on the faces of the villagers. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of foreboding. As the chanting grew louder, Chiemeka felt a strange sensation, as if his very soul was being pulled away from his body. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to the spirits. Then, suddenly, a loud clap of thunder shook the sky, and rain began to pour down. The villagers gasped, their faces lit with joy and relief as the raindrops soaked into the dry earth. But as the rain fell, a strange cry echoed through the village, a wail that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The villagers looked around in fear, but Okafor continued his chanting, his face unreadable. Then, Chiemeka fell to the ground, his body still and lifeless. Amora ran to her brother, tears streaming down her face as she held him. "No," she cried, her voice breaking. "Chiemeka, please, wake up." But he did not move. His sacrifice had been made, and the rain had come. The village was saved, but at a terrible cost. In the days that followed, the rain continued to fall, reviving the land and filling the river once more. The villagers rejoiced, but the memory of Chiemeka's sacrifice lingered in their hearts, a haunting reminder of the price they had paid. And every time the rain fell, they could still hear the echoes of the rainmaker's chant, a reminder that the spirits never give without taking something in return. The village of Ikena was saved, but the cost of their salvation would echo in their hearts forever. The rain had brought life back to Ikena, but it left behind a strange, almost eerie silence that filled the village. People went about their daily chores with quiet, solemn faces, their eyes lingering over the newly sprouting crops, and the river that once again flowed through the village. Though they had water and food, Chiemeka's death weighed heavily on them, a ghostly reminder of the bargain they had struck with the spirits. Amora could barely eat or sleep. She wandered the village, her mind replaying that night over and over. Each time it rained, she felt as though her brother's spirit was nearby, watching, a part of the rain itself. She would sometimes sit by the riverbank for hours, staring into the water, hoping to feel his presence. One evening, as she sat there in silence, Okafor appeared beside her, his tall, thin figure casting a shadow over the rippling water. "You mourn for him," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it before. Amora looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "I lost my brother," she whispered. "And for what?" "This rain, it feels like a curse." Okafor nodded slowly, as if he understood. "I warned you all that the spirits demand something in return. The rains come with a price, Amora. Your brother knew that." Amora's hands clenched into fists. "But was it worth it, Okafor? Did he have to die for this rain? What kind of spirits demand such a thing?" Okafor's face grew dark, his eyes reflecting the moonlight as he looked out over the river. "The spirits are ancient and powerful, Amora. They do not see life as we do. To them, it is merely a balance, a life for rain, a soul for salvation. Amora felt a surge of anger. Then why do you serve them? Why use such powers if they only bring pain? Okafor was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Because sometimes, we have no choice. I, too, once paid a price for these powers. I did not ask for them, Amora. But now, I am bound to the spirits, and they demand that I follow their will. Amora shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes again. Then what good is it? If the rain only brings more sorrow, what good is any of this? Okafor reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. The rains bring life, Amora. Your brother's sacrifice saved the village. It may be hard to see now, but in time, you will understand. She shrugged off his hand, her voice filled with bitterness. I don't want to understand. I want my brother back. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen in Ikena. The crops grew faster than anyone had ever seen, sprouting tall and lush, almost too quickly. The villagers marveled at their good fortune, their hearts lifting as they harvested more food than they had in years. But there was something odd about the crops. Some villagers noticed that the yams were larger than normal, but when eaten, they left an unusual aftertaste. Children began to experience nightmares, waking in the night with cries of terror. Even the animals acted differently, shying away from the fields and refusing to drink from the river. One night, a young boy named Udo ran through the village, screaming in terror. It's Chimeka, he cried. I saw him, his spirit, wandering the fields. The villagers gathered, whispering in fear. Some dismissed it as a child's imagination, but others couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was as though the rain itself carried a shadow, an invisible weight that lingered over them. Finally, they turned to Okafor once more. Rainmaker, Ikena said, his voice wavering, we do not understand what is happening. The rains came, but so did these strange happenings. Have we angered the spirits somehow? Okafor's face was grave as he listened, his hands clasped before him. The spirits have taken their price, but it seems they have left behind something unexpected. What does that mean? Amora asked, her voice filled with tension. Okafor looked at her, his gaze piercing. When a sacrifice is made, sometimes a part of the spirit remains. Chimeka's soul was taken, but it may not have fully departed. The spirits do not always leave quietly. The villagers exchanged frightened glances. So, Chimeka's spirit is still here, one man asked. Okafor nodded slowly. It is possible. The spirit may linger until it finds peace. If Chimeka's soul is restless, we must find a way to guide him to the spirit world. Amora stepped forward, her voice trembling. What must we do, Okafor? I cannot bear the thought of my brother's spirit trapped here, suffering. Okafor took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. We must perform another ritual. This one will not require a life, but it will demand your strength, Amora. Only you, as his closest kin, can call him back to peace. The following night, Amora and Okafor went to the river, where a small fire was lit. The villagers gathered at a distance, watching with bated breath. Okafor handed Amora a calabash filled with a strange mixture of herbs and river water. You must speak to him, Okafor instructed. Call him by his name and tell him it is time to rest. Offer him this water. It will serve as a bridge between our world and the spirit world. Amora knelt by the river, her hands shaking as she held the calabash. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her voice. Chimeka, she called, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Chimeka, it's me. Amora. I'm here. I know you gave everything for us. You saved our village, and we will never forget you. But, it's time to rest now. Please, Take this water and find peace." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint ripple appeared on the surface of the river, and a cold breeze brushed against Amora's face. She felt a strange warmth in her heart, as if her brother's spirit was there, listening. She poured the water into the river, watching as it flowed and merged with the current. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Goodbye, Chimecha." As the water settled, the air grew still, and a profound sense of calm washed over the villagers. The strange occurrences ceased, the crops returned to normal, and the nightmares faded. It was as though a weight had been lifted from Ikena, a sense of peace settling over the village once more. In the days that followed, Amora found herself returning to the river, where she would sit and speak to Chimecha, sharing her thoughts and memories. Though he was gone, she felt as though he was with her, watching over the village, his spirit finally at rest. The villagers continued to honor Chimecha's memory, planting a small grove of trees by the river in his name. And as the seasons passed, the rains continued to bless Ikena, bringing life and prosperity to the village. But the people of Ikena never forgot the lesson of the Rainmaker, and each time they felt the cool drops of rain on their skin, they remembered the price they had paid. The echoes of Chimecha's sacrifice lingered in their hearts, a reminder that the blessings of the spirits were never given freely, and that every life, no matter how humble, had a power that could resonate across time and beyond. The Rainmaker, Okafor, continued his solitary life, watching over the village from afar. He knew that someday, Ikena might need him again. But for now, he was content to let the rain fall in silence, knowing that the spirits had been appeased, and that, for a time at least, peace had returned to Ikena.